Week 7 of the fantasy season is now behind us, and we got to get you ready for week 8. So I'm giving you 5 key waiver wire targets that you got to get on your fantasy rosters so that way you can turn your season around or solidify it to be ready for a playoff run. The first player that we're going to be targeting on your rosters is going to be Oronde Grandsen, tight end out of the Los Angeles Chargers. He's currently only rostered in 2.1% of ESPN leagues, and I expect that number to go up handsomely after his huge breakout performance in week 7. He had 7 receptions on 9 targets for 164 yards and 1 touchdown. He actually played 79% of the snaps in week 7 for a total of 60, and he also was 3rd among all Los Angeles Chargers pass catchers. And this is also his back-to-back week where he has had 7 receptions while also dominating all the snaps among all tight ends for this Chargers offense. As you can see here, we see in week 7 he had 75% of the snaps among all tight ends. This past week he had 79%, and quite frankly he was able to take advantage of the great matchup that he had versus the Indianapolis Colts, who actually allowed the 3rd most points to opposing tight ends. And I know that the matchup in week 8 is going to be a little bit difficult, and then in week 9 he also sees the Tennessee Titans, who are also a tough matchup versus tight ends. And because of how shallow the tight end position is, I would actually go ahead and invest 15 to 20% of your fab, especially considering that we're seeing guys such as Darren Waller who are going to be suffering probably a multi-week injury with that pick injury that he suffered in week 7. This next player that you're going to want to target is going to be Xavier Legette, wide receiver out of the Carolina Panthers. He's currently only rostered in 23.2% of ESPN leagues, and you know, it's really hard to assess the kind of game he had because he had 9 receptions on 11 targets, had the only touchdown for the Carolina Panthers, and it was kind of a sloppy game versus the Jets. This offense still flows through McMillan, so I'm not saying that Legette is by any means going to threaten any targets. But what we can say, though, is that he's at least for the time being secured that wide receiver 2 role here in Carolina. And as you can see here with all the snap counts, you can see that he's been someone who's been very steady as that wide receiver 2. And in this kind of game, you can see that with a good matchup versus the Jets, this is the kind of ceiling that you can expect out of Legette. However, we have seen already, as you can look at these game logs, that his floors can be quite terrible for your fantasy rosters. So I would say tread carefully, because we are also seeing that Bryce Young may be questionable to start in week number 8, which of course will have to require Andy Dalton to be in the mix. And last season we saw Andy Dalton fill in pretty well for this Carolina offense, so I'm not saying that all hope is lost. However, I would still tread carefully just because we want to first see if this Xavier Legette thing can be sustainable for this Carolina offense, and that way we can get a better gauge on whether or not this is someone that actually can have some sustainable success for your fantasy rosters. The third player you're going to want to add on your fantasy rosters this week is going to be Kyle Monangai, running back out of the Chicago Bears. Now, he actually comes into the waiver wire at only a 4.1% roster percentage on ESPN leagues, and this past week he was phenomenal. He had 13 carries for 81 yards, averaging 6.2 yards per carry, also had a touchdown. But when we look across, we also had DeAndre Swift, who also was just as explosive, had 19 carries, 124 yards, and a very efficient outing at 6.5 yards per carry. And as you can see here, since the bye week, the snaps seem to be reflecting a much more split backfield. You see here in week 6, we saw that DeAndre Swift had 56% of the snaps versus 34% for Kyle Monangai. And then in week 7, we saw it be almost near identical at 54%. And we also see 45% for Kyle Monangai here. Now, what I'm saying here is that this is clearly DeAndre Swift's backfield. I in no way am insinuating that for the time being that this is a threat. However, if anything were, God to forbid, happen to DeAndre Swift because of injury, we can see here that this kind of game shows that Kyle Monangai can fill in and be quite explosive for this offense. So at the very least, he is someone that you can use in a pinch, especially because in week 8, we are going to be seeing 6 teams go on a bye. So if you are a little bit desperate at the running back position, I believe that Kyle Monangai at least becomes someone that you can utilize as a desperate flex play. And at the very least, be someone that you can utilize as a strong handcuff if anything were, God forbid, to happen to DeAndre Swift. You know what better week than to go ahead and play him in your rosters, because the Bears are going to be facing a very struggling Baltimore defense that actually has allowed the second most points to opposing running backs. So go ahead and I'd say 15 to 25% for Monangai, only because of the strong handcuff that he can be for your fantasy rosters. We have 2 more players to go over, but before we do so, I want to say thank you so much for getting us to over 1,000 subscribers here on the Ivan Herrera Show. And as always, I encourage you, most of you that are watching aren't already subscribed, so if you're getting value, do me a solid, hit that like button as well as the subscribe button. Let's go over these last 2 players. Okay, of these last 2 players, we're going to be going with Marvin Mims, wide receiver out of the Denver Broncos. He's currently only rostered in 19.6% of ESPN leagues. He had a pretty strong outing. He had 6 receptions on 7 targets for 85 yards and actually tied for the highest snap percentage that he has had all season, dating back since week 1 when he had the same mark at 53%. And I know that when it comes to this wide receiver room, we know that Courtland Sutton is the clear number 1, and Troy Franklin, for the most part, has secured that wide receiver 2 role here within this Denver offense. However, the reason why I feel confident targeting Marvin Mims this week on my waiver wires is because if you are one of these teams that are really shallow at the wide receiver position and you're dealing with bye weeks, I believe that Marvin Mims becomes a very solid play for you, considering that the Denver Broncos are going up against the Dallas Cowboys, and the Dallas Cowboys right now allow the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers and have actually allowed the 3rd most receiving yards to opposing wideouts. Just the matchup alone versus the Dallas Cowgirls makes it so worthwhile targeting Marvin Mims as someone that you could potentially start in a flex spot in week 8. And the final player that I'm going to be targeting for you is going to be Darnell Mooney, wide receiver out of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, he is actually currently rostered at 42.3% of ESPN leagues. Mooney had a very modest game in week 7. He had 3 receptions on 5 targets for 68 yards versus the San Francisco 49ers. In week 7, Mooney was actually 2nd among all Atlanta pass catchers with 83% of the snaps played. He also was 3rd in targets behind Kyle Pitts as well as Drake London, who both had 10 targets. We saw that we saw that Mooney had 5 targets in this matchup. And quite frankly, the main reason why I'm targeting Mooney is because we're seeing the volume steadily increase. He did have a game a couple weeks ago where he had 11 targets, and the Falcons are playing versus a very desperate 1-6 Miami Dolphins team. And granted, even though the secondary for the Dolphins has been a little bit stingy, I believe that this is a matchup that will favor the Falcons and could even potentially have them in a situation where they are able to actually target Mooney at a very high rate. Now, I believe that once again, for someone like Mooney, this is someone that you can probably invest no more than 10% of your fab, especially if you have better options at the wide receiver position. Hey, thank you so much for making it to the very end of the video. It means the absolute world to me. And listen, most of you that are watching these videos aren't already subscribed, so if you are getting value, do me a huge solid. Hit that like button as well as the subscribe button. Best of luck to you as you look to bolster up your teams through the waiver wire, and be sure to tune in towards the later part of the week as I go over some players that you should be targeting via trades. In the meantime, take care. God bless. Peace.